Before we begin, I wanted to remind you about spectrums, those diagrams we use to organize different ideologies. This spectrum shows a mix of both economic and political ideas, so let's break it down. First, there's the economic spectrum that you're hopefully very familiar with now. But what about the political spectrum? Here it is. What you can see about the spectrum is that the level of government control doesn't increase when you go left, like it does in economics. Instead, the level of government control goes up when you move away from the center. So societies that believe in democracy are in the center of the political spectrum, while the more you want the government to control the people, you will either move to the left if you want that government control to contribute to greater equality for everyone, like the Soviet Union, or you'll move to the right if you want that government control to support the elite groups you believe are superior to others, like Nazi Germany. This is why we often bow the spectrum, because the two ends are both dictatorships, even though they have different ideologies. So now, when we go back to that grid, you can see how the mix of economic and political ideas can help you see if you're a democratic socialist, or a modern liberal, or a dictatorial capitalist. That's a fascist. While you might have grown up in a society that takes democracy for granted, 3 centuries ago, many of those ideas were seen as radical or even crazy. Personal worth and dignity, free expression, human rights, private property for average people, transparency of government actions and limits on government power. No one had seen a society based on these ideas for more than a millennium. During the Middle Ages, the feeling was, of course, regular people have no rights. It's always been that way. God gave the king the right to rule over us how he sees fit. So what is democracy? It's a government based on the idea that the people do have a voice. Decisions will be based on majority rule. But you also have to respect the minority that disagreed with the decision, because all individuals have right, not just those who agree with the majority. So why would anybody want democracy? Well, there's 4 really good reasons to help explain why democracy is a great system. First, it is the government that allows for the greatest amount of freedom. Second, it responds to the will of the people. It assumes that a group of people can make better decisions for themselves than one individual or the elite will make for the whole group. Third, democracy encourages people to be more creative. Because you have a say, that means if you want something to change, you need to think of a solution, versus in a dictatorship where you can just whine and complain but not really change a thing. Finally, democracy allows for the peaceful and orderly change of government. When was the last time you saw a coup d'etat in Canada? So if you want to create a direct democracy, you need to have a few basics. Number 1, everybody has to rule in all aspects. This means every citizen gets a say on creating new rules or changing the rules that already exist. That's not the same as coming to a consensus where everyone discusses ideas until you all agree. It's going to be a vote. Majority rules. You also have to make sure that the majority decisions are being made fairly. So, for example, one man can only have 1 vote. You can't let the rich or powerful have more votes than the weak. And in order for your citizens to make the right decisions, you're going to have to allow for open communication to spread information to an educated society so that they can take that information to help form an educated opinion. But here's the problem. Most citizens in a society don't have the time or the interest to become fully educated in order to make informed decisions. So, modern democracies have adopted something known as representative democracy. It's simple. As a citizen, I only have to make one decision. Who am I going to vote for to represent me in making all of those decisions? I can then try and influence that representative when I find something that's important to me. I don't have to participate in all the decisions because I expect my representative to take the time to make that informed decision on my behalf. In order to make sure those representatives are doing their job and that the ideals of a liberal democracy are being protected, there's a variety of techniques that are established. Now, some people might have a longer or a shorter list than mine, but I've summed up the necessities in 8 techniques. Number 1, representation by population. Each vote has equal worth because each representative has a fairly equal number of constituents or voters in their riding, which is the area they represent. This protects minorities because the poorest individual has the same voice as the richest person. Second, periodic elections. Our representatives must ask us if we want them to continue to represent us by holding elections on a fairly regular basis. In a future lesson, we're going to look at the different ways to approach elections. Third, you gotta have secret ballot. In the past, voting was done out in the open, which could lead to corruption or even violence because everyone knew who you were voting for. So a candidate could bribe you to vote for him because they'd know whether or not you voted for them. Or your boss could fire you for voting against his candidate. Again, this protects the minority because they aren't afraid to vote for a party that may not be all that popular because no one knows who you're voting for. Technique number 4, independent courts. The judicial branch must have the ability to go after politicians if they're breaking the law. This is because of rule of law, the expectation that no one is above the law, a fundamental of equality and individualism. The fifth tool is power of the purse. This is a fancy way of saying that the money the government raises through taxes belongs to the country, not the members of government. So if representatives are voted out of office, they can't take the government money with them, unlike absolute monarchs, who would consider national funds their own. Another characteristic of a representative democracy is the use of political parties. In order to represent the wishes of the majority, political parties adopt an ideology that people vote for. Whichever party gets the most votes demonstrates that this is the ideology the majority of the nation supports. Technique number 7 is interest or lobby groups. These are organizations that aren't elected to government, but they do spend a lot of time trying to influence those government representatives. For example, MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They lobby or pressure the government to create legislation to reduce drinking and driving. And finally, the free press. The press plays a very important role in our society. Not only does the press keep politicians accountable by telling us what they're doing, but it also allows us to influence our politicians, like when people write a letter to the editor of the newspaper, or invite the press to cover their protest rally. Politicians pay close attention to the media and will make their decisions based on what people are saying to the press. The press can also protect minority groups by voicing their opinions against the loud voices of the majority. Although admittedly, many of those 24-hour news channels are just really loud voices that seem to just want to stir up the pot instead of finding real solutions to problems. Now, while here in Canada we support the ideas of democracy, that doesn't mean there aren't disadvantages. In fact, Winston Churchill once said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried. One serious downside to democracy is that even though we have all of these tools to try and protect the minority, often the majority will ignore the minority. That can lead to what's known as the tyranny of the majority. If a minority group doesn't have the same rights as the majority, then you no longer have a true democracy. And the question is it really majority rule if only 50% plus one person votes for something? The Quebec referendum on separation in 1995 was so close that only 50.6% of the citizens decided to stay in Canada. What if that percentage had voted to separate? Is that enough of a majority to make such a huge decision? An even bigger problem with democracy is how long it takes to make a decision. With everyone wanting to have a voice, it can take months, even years, to pass a piece of legislation. We live in a pluralistic society. This means there are many opinions on how the country should be run. A third problem is that often the elite, meaning those with money and power, get more access to the government. For example, which lobby group in Alberta do you think gets more attention? Environmental groups or oil company lobbyists? Even the government representatives themselves can lose touch with the common man and forget the people they're supposed to be representing. And the number one disadvantage to democracy, when it's working well, the people stop paying attention and become apathetic. Look at our voter turnout. We're happy when we get a 60% voter turnout. That means 40% of the citizens didn't even bother to let their opinions be known. If we don't pay attention to what politicians are doing, they can start making decisions that we disagree with before we ever realize it's happening. In our next lesson, we're going to look at electoral systems. In other words, how we elect those representatives. And you'll find out how George Bush won an election without getting the most votes.